a more inclusive. My name is Miriam Castañeda Solares. I'm the External Affairs and Advocacy Manager at STAR Network. For those of you who don't know or are not familiar with STAR Network, we are a global network of over 50 local, national, and international NGOs. With presence in 6 continents. And what brings us together is a sense of urgency to transform the humanitarian system. And we want to see transformations in the sector, especially in locally led action and also anticipatory action. And of course, we want to make sure that the system and this sector is accountable to the communities that we serve. So thank you so much for being here. We have a lot to cover in the next, 85 minutes. And we're hoping to have a very interesting discussion and a very open discussion, especially we wanted to make sure that we feel, that we're able to talk and discuss things openly. I think that this is very much the spirit of STAR Network. So we are hoping to hear from you as well about your concerns, your ideas, and how we can move forward in this topic that we believe is quite important. So I just want to remind everyone who is joining us remotely that we have Spanish and French interpretation, so please do use the right channel, and please feel free to communicate with us and interact with us in your preferred language. Now, the topic that we're discussing today is part of one of the priority topics at HNPW, localization. And in that context, when we talk or advocate for localization, very few people, if anyone at all, is against it, right? However, we believe that there are some challenges in how we make this happen. And that's really the issue. And that's what we wanted to bring this conversation to HNPW, because we believe that despite international commitments, there has been really limited progress in the localization agenda. And indirect cost recovery, more commonly known as overhead costs, is a tangible step to have a better share of power. And it also relates to other topics that are present in the humanitarian system, but sometimes we are a bit uncomfortable or afraid of discussing or talking. And we're not taking those topics with the seriousness that they deserve or with the concern that they deserve. And sometimes, if I'm very honest, we tend to ignore those topics. So here at HNPW, we believe that it is fundamental that we address those uncomfortable topics. We're not gathered here to say or to congratulate each other. We're here to be accountable to each other and actually to remind ourselves what is the purpose of being in the humanitarian sector. So the conversation that we will have today will reflect and will, in a way, mirror some of the other topics that we believe are important to address, as inequality, power imbalances, the lack of inclusiveness, and even double standards that we have in the sector. But also we hope that we can share some success stories about how to make change possible. I want to use this opportunity as well to be very clear that we, and I'm talking we as STAR Network, we're far from being in the place where we want to be or we aspire to be in terms of ICR sharing. And we are very transparent about this. We don't have this figured out, but we are embracing this topic with openness and also from a very humble perspective. We need to make some changes, and I think that we need to understand better what the sector needs. So yes, there's a lot that we have to work on, and that's why we're here. The good news is that we are not alone in this journey, and we are very inspired by Star Fund Bangladesh and the remarkable changes that they have been able to make in such a limited time. Which brings me to our great and very diverse panelists that we have for today. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Sajid Raihan. He's Star Fund Bangladesh country manager. Fakrul Islam, he's Star Fund Bangladesh partnership coordinator. Jahin Shams, he's from UTRAN. He's the program development specialist, and he's joining us remotely. Also, Mostaq Hussain, he's a humanitarian director at Save the Children Bangladesh, who's also joining us remotely. Fran Gerling, she's the Senior Policy and Engagement Advisor at Development Initiatives. And finally, Stephen Williams, he's an advisor to the Rhine Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, who is joining us here. So before we go into the discussion, we have a video that we want to share with you because we recognize that many of the local and national organizations are not able to join us today or are not able to be physically here. And we want to make sure that this session is instrumental to amplify those voices. So Vincent, whenever you're ready.
আইসিআর যদি আমরা না পাই তাহলে খুবই নানা জটিলতার মধ্যে আসলে থাকে। যেমন আমি যদি বলি যে অর্গানাইজেশন ওনারশিপ দাঁড়ায় না।
লোকাল অর্গানাইজেশনের জন্য আইসিআর বা ওভারহেড অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। তার কার্যক্রম চলমান রাখার জন্য, তার স্কিলড স্টাফকে ধরে রাখবার জন্য।
তো আইসিআরটা থাকলে আমরা লোকাল লেভেলের, আমরা যে লোকালাইজেশনের কথা বলছি, সেই লোকাল লেভেলের মানুষের চাহিদার ভিত্তিতে আমরা তাৎক্ষণিকভাবে উদ্যোগ নিতে পারি। যদি আমাদের আইসিআর না থাকে তাহলে একটা সময় এই অর্গানাইজেশনগুলো আসলে টিকতে পারবে না।
একটা অর্গানাইজেশনের প্রজেক্টের জন্য যে বাজেটটা দেওয়া হয়, প্রজেক্টের স্টাফ বা প্রজেক্ট ম্যানেজমেন্টের জন্য, প্রজেক্ট অপারেশনের জন্য যে কস্টটা দেওয়া হয়, তার বাইরে কিন্তু অর্গানাইজেশনের আদার মেকানিজমগুলো, আদার ফ্যাসিলিটিস সেগুলো ব্যবহার হয়, সেগুলোর জন্য কিন্তু কোনো কম্পেনসেশন হয় না। যে কোনো প্রকল্পে আমরা মনে করি ইনডিরেক্ট কস্ট রিকভারির একটা অপশন থাকা দরকার।
এই আইসিআর ওভারহেড কস্টটা খুবই দরকারি যদি আমরা বাংলাদেশের লোকাল অর্গানাইজেশন আর ডেভেলপমেন্টটা চাই।
টাকার পলিসি করতে গেলে বেশ কিছু ধাপ আছে বা একটু নলেজেবল লোক লাগে, সেগুলো আমরা সংগ্রহ করতে পারছি এই আইসিআর এর টাকা ছিল সেটা দিয়ে।
দুটো প্রজেক্টে আমরা প্রায় 4.5 লাখ টাকা আইসিআর পেয়েছি। আমরা সফটওয়্যার ইনস্টল করার জন্য একটা হাই কনফিগারেশনের কম্পিউটার কিনেছি। এমার্জেন্সি রেসপন্স টিমের জন্য বেস তৈরি করেছি।
করোনাকালীন সময় আমরা তাৎক্ষণিকভাবে মানুষকে সহযোগিতা করতে পেরেছিলাম ওই আইসিআর থেকে।
আইসিআর দিয়ে ইতিমধ্যে আমি আমার অর্গানাইজেশনের স্টাফদের জন্য ক্যাপাসিটি বিল্ডিং ট্রেনিংয়ের আয়োজন করেছি, প্রয়োজনীয় ইকুইপমেন্ট কিনেছি এবং আমাদের বোর্ড রিপেয়ার করেছি।
আইসিআর মানে হলো রেস্ট্রিক্টেড না।
আইসিআর দেওয়ার ক্ষেত্রে তাদের জন্য একটা কমন আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং থাকে সকল ডোনারের।
কত পার্সেন্টেজ টাকা দেবে এবং তারা কত পার্সেন্টেজ রাখতেছে সেই বিষয়গুলো যেন আসলে চুক্তির ভিতরে থাকে।
আইসিআর শুড বি এট দ্য মিনিমাম লেভেল অফ 10%।
একটি অভিন্ন পলিসি তৈরি করে সমস্ত প্রজেক্টের জন্য ইকুয়াল আইসিআর শেয়ার করে।
আপনারা কাইন্ডলি কস্ট শেয়ারিং এর টাকা দাবি করবেন না, আপনারা ছোট এনজিওগুলোকে কিছু ফ্লেক্সিবল ফান্ড দিন।
Well, I think that that's a good introduction for our first panelist. So Sajid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miriam. So welcome you all online and offline to the presentation today. So let me start with a brief background of who we are and where we are here. So Vincent, the next slide, please. So Start Fund Bangladesh is pilot initiative of START network. The next slide. Yeah, that's okay. And it had funding support from the FCDO since 2017. And the objective was to devolve decision-making and resource closer to the communities. And Start Fund Bangladesh is a platform of 47 member organizations, 27 local and 20 international NGOs. And as we are a kind of pilot initiative of START network, and as we really believe that it's a system change initiative and that envisions shifting power, resource, and behavior to promote an equitable humanitarian system. So my presentation today will be based on our experiences from the last 5 years with local and international NGOs. And today we will be talking about one of the behavior shift around ICS sharing. So please bear with me. The next slide, please. If I start with the moral obligation of the presentation, so instead we talk more about having an equitable humanitarian system. And we feel that to create more equitable humanitarian system and anti-racist institutions, we must first acknowledge the role new colonial legacies continue to play in humanitarian assistance and the protection activities and within humanitarian organization, which are most at need of equity-driven systemic changes. I will start with the 3 imbalances that we are experiencing at the Global South. The first one is about shrinking space of local NGOs. So there are less or no money from donors for organizational development nowadays, and organizations are being unable to strengthen their systems and processes, which is heavily impacting their capacities to respond. Funds are not going directly to the local organizations, and local national NGOs have little or no access to ICR that hampers their income, initiatives, and longer-term investments in organizational development and sustainability. It is also widely perceived that local NGOs do not have capacities, and these perceptions prevail because we have very little hard or Western kind of evidence. So as a whole, a power imbalance exists, and there are systems that continue reproducing the imbalance, which we need to address through systemic changes. The next slide. As you see from the bar chart, I mean, why we are talking about ICR? So the first problem that we identified from the very beginning of the initiative in 2017, we have seen the responses from 2017 and 2018, which are mostly awarded to NGOs, but most part of it are kind of implemented through local organizations, but local organizations did not get any share of the ICR. And the next slide, we will see that 83% of the total expenditure accounted for local organization for the implementation cost, but they got 0% of the ICR cost. The next slide. And also, you know, we have seen that there are imbalances exist in between, you know, NGOs and INGOs, the way how they treat each other. So if we see in a bilateral partnership, local organizations share ICR equally with partner local organizations, where NGOs keep more for themselves. If you look at the last bar chart at the very end corner, that the NGOs, while they were implementing 18% of the project cost, but then they are getting 72% of the ICS sharing. The next slide. Also, we have seen it in the consortium partnership, while the NGOs are treating NGOs in a way and treating the local organizations in a different manner. And NGOs share more ICR with their NGO partners. And also, you know, if you look at the last bar, so NGOs are only 9% having implementation costs, where they have around 67% of the ICR cost, keeping with themselves, and where they are also sharing 25% of the ICR with an NGO, when they are sharing only 8% of ICR with local NGO. So there is a disparity in the behavior of the NGOs towards local and national organizations. The next slide. So what we did, I mean, after that, and we were thinking, you know, how we address the particular concern, because in a platform, it's a local, national, international organizations, we are coming together, and how we create that imbalance. So we have tried, you know, a three-pronged approach. We tried to negotiate with the local organizations. We tried to nudge them. We try to influence them so that they negotiate ICS sharing with their NGO partners. We facilitated the co-creation of organizational system strengthening plan with some of the local organizations. And the objective was, again, you know, to nudge them so that they can invest the ICR in their organizational development planning. So it was not just about, you know, ensuring that ICR are shared equally, but also about trying to ensure that the ICR are invested in the organizational development. Next slide. What has been changed? So we started with 20 member NGOs back in 2017. And by 2018, we onboarded another 27 local organizations. And then they started accessing the START fund from July 2019. In 2020, 80% of the START fund funding went directly to local national member organizations, and which is why it gave the local national organizations the scope and confidence to negotiate ICS sharing with their NGO counterparts. And from July 29 to December 2020, we've seen that 7 START Fund Bangladesh member NGOs access the fund directly, and 5 of them shared ICR with their local partners. This is another behavior change that happened because of the good intention from the international NGO members. But we have also got some of the internal advocates within the NGOs who were advocating with their global North offshore country headquarter offices. And if I give an amount, so total ICR amount that channeled during the period was around 347,000 pounds. And then out of them, around 278,000 went to the local national organizations directly or indirectly. And that really gave them the opportunity to invest it, next slide please, you know, in their organizational development. So how this change happened? As I was saying, the NGO country office, because, you know, we have a local national setup, which means that the NGO country office have more participation in the decision making, more engagement in proposal submissions, and more ownership over alert cycle management process, and which was formally managed and coordinated by their NGO global offices. So by bringing the whole mechanism at the national level, bringing the decision making, engagement, participation at the national level, that really helped the NGOs to, at the country office, to have you know, more ownership. We have also seen that there is a power imbalance exist even in between the global office and the country office. So it's more of a north-south issue beside also a local international issue. So preposition funds at the country level, because that's the whole theory about Start Fund Bangladesh, that we have the preposition funding. And then those funding is transferring from one national bank account to another national bank account, which means that the monies are not, you know, going through the headquarters and then from the headquarters coming to the local national country offices, which means that that also gave more authority to the NGO country office to share equitable share, even from their global headquarters. What we also did that, you know, nudging members on the equitable ICR sharing. So we really inspired member organization to share ICR. We tried to find out the champions who were doing good, doing those internal advocacy. We were sharing ICR data, sharing the good practice so that others are inspired. And then there are internal advocates within the international organizations who are really playing a very key role to convince their organizations, their seniors, the SMTs and other. And then several NGOs negotiated those, and we have seen it, in our country, there are at least 4 to 5 NGOs who did those advocacy. Some were successful and some were not. So we are very much in the middle of our journey. The next slide, please. Yeah, so what was the impact? As I was saying, that we were not just ensuring that the local organizations getting ICR share, but also how they invested smartly. If we see the existing business model of NGOs, that ICR is one of the big income sources. And what the NGOs do smartly is investing them in the organizational development, and then that really pays them back when they're, and it brings sustainability to the whole organization. So as I have shown, that around £278,000 that the local organization got as ICR because of direct and indirect funding access. So they invested, around 70% of those ICR in financial management, governance, systems and processes. And we have seen that because of it, we had a baseline of their due diligence scoring, and we did those again with some of the selected organizations, and we found that their due diligence scores increased by 16%, within 3 years of time with us. Yep. Yeah. So that's all. I will not be saying everything. My colleague Fokrul is there. He will be also focusing. And then I'm handing over to Miriam because I think our members are waiting online. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajid. So yes, I would like to open the floor to some questions from the audience. I know that we have, let me see how many people we have online. Over 65 people joining us online. So thank you for your comments and questions. So yes, any question from the audience that is in person? Yes, please.
Elise Belcher from Global Network for Disaster Reduction, GNDR.
Sorry, can I ask you if you can go to the microphone? So sorry, I didn't mention that just for our...
Hi,
yeah.
Elise Belcher, Global Network for Disaster Reduction, GNDR. Just wondering what your overall aim is. So you've mentioned different percentages, for example, the INGO implementing 18%, yet taking more of the ICR. Do you want them therefore to get 18% worth of the ICR? Do you want them not to have any if all implementation is done through local and national NGOs, or is it 50-50? Could you just clarify those? Thank you.
Straight, yeah, okay. I mean, the ideal scenario will be 50-50. Another radical scenario would be that if I'm implementing 80%, then the ICR has to be 80%, 18%, right? So the radical scenario is very equitable. The ideal scenario would be at least 50-50 of the ICR sharing. It's very, very important also, from an NGO perspective, because as the local organizations have more capacity, which means that the NGOs, when they are partnering with the local organizations, they also, have the benefit of that capacity of the local organization.
Great. We have some questions online. How is it possible to change NGOs' ICR sharing mentality beyond the STAR network? Even though many NGOs are signatories of Charter for Change and other protocols, they are not following those at the practice level. So I don't know if that's a question for you, Sajid, but any comment on this?
I think, we really need to think around the role of the intermediaries, how we will be playing the role, what kind of support we will be providing. Do we wish to see us in an implementation role, or we wish to see us more in a technical capacity? And it has to be negotiated, it has to be consulted, and it has to be agreed between the national, international, and local players, because it's a humanitarian ecosystem and we are all existing in different layers of the ecosystem. So how we complement each other, how we do the collaboration, and how we find the collaborative strengths in our partnership. So it's very much a negotiated process. We cannot impose it. It has to be accepted, agreed, consulted, discussed, and it has to respect all the opinions. But it's a process we wish to really push forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajid. So I think that we'll move now to the presentation from Jahin. I don't know if you can hear us.
Again.
Great. Over to you, Jahin.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jahin Shamshakkar, and I'm currently working at Uttaran as a program development specialist in Bangladesh. And also, I'm a member of Start Fund Bangladesh. Uttaran is a member of Start Fund Bangladesh, and it's great to be able to join with everyone virtually and with all the people here as well. So, I wanted to talk about the experience that I had, my organization had in terms of sharing ICR. And thank you, Sajid Bhai, for laying the foundation with such a wonderful presentation. As Sajid Bhai and the video have said, that it's vital for an organization, but it's not often the case that that we get ICR. The experience of Uttaran is not always great with accessing ICR. In fact, beyond Start Fund, as the last question suggests, that beyond Start Fund, the humanitarian, like getting an ICR from a humanitarian or be it a development project is actually, for us in our experience, it was rare before. It's getting a little bit better now, but it is still quite rare. We have to work with a bunch of NGOs and UN bodies and multilaterals and bilaterals. And we have seen that ICR sharing by NGOs are a bit rare, because I'm going to explain that in a little bit, but for example, in the UN contracts that we get, for example, we work with the UNDP, we work with the WFP, and several, for example, we worked under the SARF Central Emergency Response Fund. And we have seen that we have provided cash to around 5,000 people, but that money is transferred by the WFP, our contractor, directly into the account of people. And we just received like a subcontracting grant as like a service delivery boy for those who do the service, most likely like a subcontracting. And yes, it included some, the overall service delivery included 15% of the total volume of the money, and it also included 7% of the ICR. So the overall money that we got for delivering the service, that included staff salary, travel and transport and awareness and all that, and includes 15% of the money that we have provided to the people. Now, it's a similar practice. The UN has started this practice last year, and similar practice is being started by them right now, by NGOs as well, where they do the procurement, they do everything, and we just be the delivery guy. If this, it's important for us to have this share equally. I felt that the way the contracts are made are one of the key reasons why we fail to access ICR. I know there are Charter for Change. I know the UN has commitments, but itself, I just feel like they somehow find a loophole out of their own mechanism. It's their commitment, but they somehow find a loophole that I'm not going to share ICR based on the operation cost. I'm going to share ICR on the management cost, but that's not what it should be. It should be overall, based on the overall project, based on the overall size of the project. And as in the videos you have seen, my colleagues from Bangladesh, they have explained why this money is important or why this money is needed. For us, we use this for organizational development. Like, for example, we have a huge criteria for safeguarding nowadays, right? Implementing a safeguarding policies, you need team and people, right? And no one pays for that. But ICR is important for those kind of things, as Sajid Bhai said, for internal control, for governance, for better due diligence scores. And we have highly paid project staff, but who supports them in the background? Who supports these people in monitoring? Who supports these people in terms of communication? And who supports these? These are not paid. So when we accessed ICR from Start Fund Bangladesh, I think we immediately appointed a communication officer through which we are able to do Facebook-based or social media-based fundraising during the time of COVID, when there was no one else supporting in Bangladesh. So these are vital. See, that small amount that was provided in a 1.5 month contract was enough to sustain us for the next year. When there was a pandemic going on, we could actually use that person that we financed from that ICR source to gather more money. To raise funds. So that is vital for the development and the growth of an organization. it is needed for emergency operations. When there is no one is working, we have a small emergency pot fund. A portion of our ICR funding goes to the small emergency pot fund. And thus, as a result, during COVID in 2011 in Bangladesh, during the Delta variant outbreak, when there was no INGOs working, in the majority of the UN and INGOs were not working. Even START did have some struggles during that time. We actually, Uttaran, we were, because we are local organization people, we saw people are suffering. Because we are in more grounded, we saw people are suffering, so we had to take some actions. And those ICR amounts actually allow us to use that money as a foundation to gather more money, do crowdfunding, do something else, access the diaspora, access other humanitarian funding mechanisms. So that allows us, that helps us. I think if we don't receive ICR, I think these sort of things stops. This kind of initiative stops. A lot of NGOs in Bangladesh have been created, and a lot of NGOs in Bangladesh have died over the last. I am 30 years old. Over the last 30 years, I've seen this for the last 25 years that some NGOs which are really big in the past now are there no more. And one of the main reasons behind is this is the lack of an organizational support that is required, forcing them to do other things. ICR should be, and I also believe that ICR should not be paid against the management cost. No. And ICR should be paid against the whole sum, the whole money that comes into your account. And that is vital, for ensuring that that there is equitability in this partnership. There is a trust in this partnership. It is absolutely vital. And the next thing that I wanted to share that we must, as what should we do as local and national organizations? Like, for example, last year I was talking to during one of the cyclones, I was talking to our director that if that particular NGO is not providing me ICR, I'm not going to work with them. And our director said that don't do this because he's going to find someone else to work for you, or he's going to find someone else to work, because there are so many local and national NGOs in Bangladesh that if I decline that I'm not going to work without ICR, then definitely they'll find someone else to work with. And that has been the culture so far in Bangladesh, that it's from this NGO to that NGO to that NGO, and they never disclose that we are changing this NGO because they demanded ICR. They just somehow find that this is our fault, that's why we are changing the ICR. And the INGO community in Bangladesh or the UN community in Bangladesh is very close together. So if one NGO or one INGO cancels partnership with us because we demanded ICR, a lot of other things that follows, the other negative impact, it follows behind one after the other, and thus resulting in our NGO becoming in a vulnerable position. We are losing a funding from not just one source just because we demanded ICR, but from multiple sources because the NGO community, the INGO community is very well intact and very, very close. That's why we need similar platform. That should be the role of national NGOs in Bangladesh, local NGOs in Bangladesh, where we need similar platforms, similar demand that as our colleague from DAM have said in the video, that a 10% ICR should be a baseline, and we should raise our voice that a 10% ICR should be a baseline. Once again, I like to say that ICR is not something that is that should be given to us, but is actually a right of local and national NGOs to access. Thank you so much for providing me this platform, Mariam. Thank you, HNPW. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. And I think that there are a lot of questions in the chat already for you, but I'll open the floor in a few minutes to the audience, both online and in person. But I do want to ask you one question. So can you just explain, if you don't receive ICR, what challenges would you face in your organization? Can you give us specific examples?
Yes, definitely. First of all, the next day, if I'm not receiving ICR, the next day I'm going to, I have to release my comms team. There are two people who works in my comms team. I have to release them immediately. And probably when I'm doing my crowdfunding next year, I'm not going to have my comms team. Number two, if I'm not getting my ICR, I will not be able to generate evidences and documents that I have done over the years. Like, for example, within the Start Fund program, we did a video on migration that helped us to land another big fund by UNOPS. It's a development project, but we did a video on migration that helped us to land another project by UNOPS on migration. So you see that we will not be able to do those which will help us do fundraising. People talked about staff. You need quality backup support. An NGO has two phases. One, the actor, one behind is the director, right? The actors are your program and project people, and behind is your audit, is your finance, is your monitoring, is your directors, is your administration. If you do not have a strong director and a strong actor, you can cast Leonardo DiCaprio, the movie will not be good enough. The operation will not be good enough. So that's what I'm saying, that you need to have those backup supports, and to have those quality people, to keep those quality people, to keep the capacity that you built over the years, to keep them at your office, you need those ICR supports. That's what I felt. And also, we all NGOs have a need for expansion. We want to reach more areas. We want to reach more people. We want to work in further areas. So those are very vital for, those are some of the practical examples that if I don't get ICR, I'll not probably able to even have a dream of expansion probably in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. I have other questions for you, but I think that we are running out of time. So I will now invite Mastic Hussain. He's a humanitarian director for Save the Children Bangladesh, and it will be really interesting to hear from you, your experience and why you decided to change some of the practices within Save the Children Bangladesh. Over to you, Mastic.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it is nice to have you be there here, as well as thank you for inviting me to join this session. I think let me share my experience of what actually we learned from or by sharing the ICR with our partner NGOs. When Start Fund Bangladesh established in Bangladesh, we first couple of years we didn't apply for any sorts of start funding sources, because that time we tried to support the localization agenda, and that's why we tried to allow more spaces for local NGOs to apply for start funds. So a couple of years we didn't apply for any start fund. Later on in 2019, we started applying again, because we found that many organizations are applying, and it has been something that there are a lot of alert notes as well as decisions on funding, so alert funding cycles. So we started applying from 2019. So 2019, we were able to share our ICR with our local partner, working in a flash flood response in northeast region of Bangladesh. And that was because of, since by that time Start Fund Bangladesh started sharing or sending the budget to our account locally. That means using local currency, Bangladesh currency, not coming through our member or from our headquarters. So that allowed us to access the fund quickly. And in some cases, we discussed with our member agencies. That time, our member agency was Save the Children New Zealand. They communicated with Save the Children UK, and they allowed us to use ICR for Bangladesh purpose. And that was the first time actually, since it was Bangladeshi currency, our member agency, our headquarters didn't charge any ICR that time. So since we got the 10% ICR, we shared that one with our local partner as well as our for Bangladesh country office. That helped our local partner to own the project, as because they use the money not only for the programmatic purpose, which there are some unseen expenditures which is not budgeted in the program. So they use that money for unseen expenditures as well as some management costs outside of the project. So that gave them better flexibility in terms of managing the program, both for their response program as well as other programs. And why we were able to share that ICR with our local partner, because as I said, one is of course our member and country office, our center, that means headquarters, allowed us to use the ICR for Bangladesh country office. This was and creating that space to decide by ourselves. That's why we were able to share that ICR with our local partner. Another point is that if we do not receive any ICR as a country office of an international organization, then it is difficult for us to share the ICR with other local partners. So since it was the earlier, the money was in US dollar and coming from our headquarters and member agencies, so ICR was charged by our member and center. So that was the challenge at that time, that we could not share any sorts of ICR. But when we got that flexibility to access that ICR from Bangladesh country office, then we instantly allowed that money sharing with our local partner. We had a lot of discussions with our partner, what should be the ideal percentage for them to cover their expenses and unseen expenditure. And by discussion with that one, 4%, 6%, that means they took 4%, we took 6% that time. That was the initial first time that we shared that ICR with our local partner. And they were very much positive after getting the ICR, because they get that, as I said, that lots of ownership was there, and that gave them flexibility of spending the money for their different purposes. So I think this was one of the learning experience for us in terms of sharing ICR with our local partner. Before that, we never shared any ICR, because that is the concern from our side, as I said before, that if we do not receive any ICR, then how we can receive ICR with our local partner? The challenge is there. But I think Start Fund, Global Start Fund Bangladesh also can take the responsibility and shouldering the next step to discuss with different NGOs, headquarters and member agencies to finalize and coming up with a suitable solution on this, how this ICR can be shared with the local partners. I agree with the thinking that definitely we should share the ICR with our local partner to provide them greater flexibility, greater power in terms of their capacity, in terms of their management. As Jain said, that if the ICR is not there, they might be losing some staff, they might be losing a couple of initiatives, which is important for our local partners to keep the capacity with them, so that they also can support in terms of managing a quality response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mastek, and thank you for, be a champion on this topic. I am wondering, why do you think, or what's the message that you can share with other NGOs? Why should NGOs care about this? Why is it important?
I think, like the local organizations, the NGOs country office, they also have some expenditure that needs to be covered, which they also need flexibility to spend the money in terms of management, in terms of keeping the capacity. So that's why a fair share is of course important. And I think if this is not there, definitely there will be a lot of embarrassing situation, because local organizations, since we are talking about supporting localization agenda, and in reality you are not doing it, that will create imbalancing or some sorts of dissatisfaction from our local partner. But my concern is that there should be a mechanism of having ICR for the country offices of NGOs.
Thank you so much, Mastek. Again, we have lots of questions in the chat and over 70 people joining us remotely, but we have to cover other presentations as well. So I would like to invite now to Stephen Williams for your presentation, and yes, we'll listen from you.
Thank you very much. Whilst we get up my presentation, yeah, just as a quick means of introduction, I'm Steve. I am a humanitarian advisor to the FCDO, humanitarian advisor on localization, AEP and humanitarian reform, which is a title I more or less made up myself. So I'm in a slightly strange position where I do provide technical advice to a donor, but I'm not actually a civil servant. So nothing I say should be interpreted as official policy. Which does free me up to speak my mind a little bit more, and just to kind of pin or to kind of lay out my position from the start. I think the situation of indirect costs and how they're managed is a complete scandal. I think it is something that needs to change. I think it is one of the most significant changes that we could make to contribute towards the localization agenda going forward. But I'm also quite critical of local and national actors in this aspect, and their inability to be able to advocate for change effectively. I think that indirect costs wasn't something that was highlighted during the Grand Bargain negotiations. It's barely been mentioned in the Grand Bargain 2 conversations. And I think this needs to become a kind of central topic. And I work very closely with a number of local and national actors. It gives me kind of great pleasure to be on the panel here today with my Bangladeshi brothers that I've worked a lot with in the past, and they continue to inspire me and inform my thinking. But I think that a lot of energy has been put in by national and local actors in setting up guidelines and best practice for donors. And generally donors aren't interested in changing their policies. So I would like to propose that the local and national actors focus a little bit more on how they can come together, create a shared language, create shared principles of how they can act in a way that is likely to be able to pressure change within the humanitarian system. So if I may, I would like to kind of outline some key principles that I think it would be great if we could get all local and national actors to get behind. Now I'm going to lay out 5 principles that I think are great, and I'd be really interested to hear if people agree with them or disagree with them or would like to add extra ones, and we can make this part of a conversation. So Vincent, if you could move the presentation on. So the 5 principles I've got here are very, very simple. But firstly, I think we all need to agree that the current approach to indirect costs is unacceptable and exploitative. Okay, it's not inefficient, it's exploitative. And we need to be very, very clear that there is an ethical issue here that needs to be resolved. Okay, the second principle is that local and national actors need indirect costs just as much as international actors, if not more. I still go into meetings and conversations with donors and UN agencies, and at times with INGOs, and there is a persistent argument that international actors need indirect costs because they need to run head offices, they need to do communications, they need to do fundraising. Now, possibly that was a valid argument 15 years ago. I suspect not, but give the benefit of doubt, that is no longer a valid argument because local actors are doing exactly the same activities and need access to indirect costs. Okay. The third principle is indirect costs must be given as indirect costs, which sounds a little bit tautological, but what I'm saying here is they must be given as unrestricted costs and not as restricted administration of costs. I think there is a standard practice by a lot of implementing or intermediary agencies to provide their downstream partners with a small amount of direct administrational costs so they can keep all of the indirect costs. I did the same when I used to work for NGOs. Now, $1 of indirect unrestricted costs is worth far, far more than $1 of restricted costs. Okay, so we will be very clear when we're talking about indirect costs, we're talking about unrestricted costs. Now, this I think is been slightly confused by the language we use. We confuse administrational costs with overhead costs with indirect costs. And the SCDO has actually got a completely different name for their indirect costs. They talk about NPAC, which is non-project applicable costs. Now, it's a real pain that one donor has decided to use a completely different name than all other donors. But actually, I think it's actually quite a useful name because it very clearly states that for indirect costs are for costs which can't be attributed specifically to a project. And I think particularly during COVID, a lot of the people advocating for more indirect costs were confusing arguments here. There was an argument that agencies needed more indirect costs because they needed to buy PPE for their projects. For me, that is not an indirect cost. That is a direct program cost because it's related to the project. So local and national actors working in COVID areas needed greater direct costs for PPE as well as their indirect costs. Let's not confuse the two issues. Okay. So now the fourth principle is indirect costs should be proportional to program implementation. This is the one that I'm least sure about. So please, if you disagree, let me know. I sense that if local national actors are implementing 50% of a project, they should be receiving 50% of the indirect costs. Now, this is going to threaten the business model for a lot of INGOs, and it's not something that we can snap our fingers and expect INGOs to to accept overnight. Okay, it needs to be a process of change. It would be unfair to introduce this kind of rule overnight, but let's be clear, I think, and I'm happy to hear contrary views, but I think this is the direction we need to be moving the sector towards. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, whatever the policy, okay, we must demand transparency through tracking. Again, I think this was an error in the grand bargain. We demanded that, I talk about collective we, but there was a demand that 25% of funds in the humanitarian sector went to local and national actors. We came up with a target before we even had ways of being able to measure that target, okay? What I would say to people like START, who I'm a great fan of and used to work for, is, and you know, the DEC, and UN funding mechanisms, is we don't have to ask our partners to change any of their policies. Just make sure that in their budgets, there's a separate budget line that states what percentage of funds of indirect costs have been passed to local and national actors. And if it's zero, fine. At least you're being honest and transparent. I think that's a very, very low bar to set of a requirement for our partner organizations. But how do we then operationalize this? Well, I think I've been looking at different models, and I think there's kind of 5 archetypal models that we could use to inform our negotiations. And again, there may be more. Vincent, please. Again, and again. So these are the 5 I've come up with. I just want to go through very quickly how each of them, these work. And again, if there's any more, please do let me know. Let's further this conversation. So if we go to the first one, which is core costs, Vincent. Core costs is again, a lot of local national actors are demanding core costs. So essentially you would be given money on an annual or biannual basis to organizations. And essentially you take indirect costs then out of the question because they already have these funds. It's a very predictable system. It means that organizations can invest. They know how much money is coming in. They can recruit staff, you know, for a complete year. I'm not a massive fan of advocating for core cost policy because there's simply too many organizations out there, and it would require donors to decide which of those are winners, which are the favorite organizations that are going to be supported. They would tend to be the very, very large national agencies, and there'd be one in each country. So I don't think it's an effective way to be able to stimulate the growth of civil society. So the second model is a fixed rate model. I mean, this is the prevailing model, right? That, you know, some organizations use 7%, some use 10%. It's very easy to understand. That's why it's prevailed for such a long time. Generally speaking, it doesn't go beyond the first tier partner, which is problematic. I also agree with recommendations that were in the video that 7% is far too low. You know, at a minimum 10%, I think is a much fairer reflection of what indirect costs should be. The third kind of model is proportionate model. This is the model I think that we should be moving towards. This is potentially so I'm just making sure I've got the calculations right there. I mean, this shouldn't theoretically increase the costs for indirect costs anymore. I think I've made a mistake here in this document. But essentially, if an organization is implementing 50%, they should be getting 50% of those funds. It's very easy to calculate. The major problem of it at the moment is that it would threaten, it'd be an existential threat on the INGO business model. And yeah, that can't happen overnight. INGOs serve many purposes. They're a key part of our sector. We can't destroy them overnight. So I'm not advocating for this to happen immediately, but I think a progressive movement towards this is needed. The fourth model, which I think is most closely resembles what the Start Fund Bangladesh is doing, is a partnership model where indirect costs are negotiated with the partners that are involved in the consortium or in the network. I think this is great when you've got a small number of actors that meet with each other on a regular basis because you can build up trust, understanding, and you can understand why each organization needs the amount of percentages that's agreed upon. The problem is, though, when you start having grant management lines, which are much more extended, you have people in London or Brussels or Geneva making decisions on partners which are a long, long way away from your offices. I'm not sure if it's a particularly scalable model. And I think that the first tier partner, which will tend to be an international partner, will generally have the upper hand in negotiations, and local and national partners will continue to be squeezed. I had a conversation with an organisation called Street Child recently, and they've got quite an interesting model where they partner up with a local actor and make, they call it the reverse prime model. They make the local actor the lead organisation, and then they negotiate a cut of the indirect costs as a consortium partner, providing kind of capacity strengthening building activities. And then, yeah, talking about capacity strengthening, the kind of fifth model, or that I think exists, is kind of a collection of different models. And this is a model which allows for much, much higher indirect costs, but you get around this by replacing the term indirect costs by saying that this is essentially a budget line for capacity strengthening. Now, this is what the FCDO did for its humanitarian funding guidelines, which were written during the COVID crisis and were used for an £18 million RRF, as a rapid response facility allocation to a number of partners during the pandemic. And these guidelines, which are considered to be best practice guidelines, they haven't been adopted by any of the FCDO country offices, and the decentralized manner in which the UK FCDO works means that each country office can decide which policies that they follow, but I would encourage people to advocate at a country level for the FCDO to adopt these guidelines, because they're allowed to. And in those guidelines, we did a number of interesting things. We introduced the policy of tracking downstream indirect costs. We also made it a requirement to state how the percentage of funds that were going to local and national actors, percentage of funds that were going to women-led organisations, and percentage of funds that were going to organisations of persons of disability. And those figures had to appear in the project proposal, in the intermediate report, and in the final report. So we're tracking it all the way through. But most significantly, we also introduced a new budget line, which we called LSAC, which was localisation support and admin costs. And we said, right, we will give the lead organisation their NPAC, as we call it, their indirect costs, their full indirect costs. But then we'll introduce another budget line, which we'll see essentially as a capacity strengthening budget line. And we will give the same amount, or 10%, whichever is highest, to the second tier local and national actors. Okay. Now, this increased our operational costs substantially. I would argue it didn't increase them, it just made them more transparent, because those operational costs exist. And we justified it to the accountants involved in these decisions as the fact that it wasn't indirect costs, it was capacity strengthening. And I still think that this is probably the best way to do capacity strengthening activities. There are other models as well. One donor I've been talking to has been considering a kind of incentive model that if their first tier partner distributes more than 25% of funds to local and national actors, they will increase the indirect costs to both the lead organisation and the downstream partner. So there's a number of different models that could go down there. So those are the kind of archetypal models. I'd be very interested to see if there's other models that I've overlooked. Just as some final words, Vincent, on my last slide. The international system is based on power, and kind of principled arguments are only going to take us so far. We've got to get local and national actors together and advocating collectively. If we just finish the last couple of slides there. And I would also say, though, that donors and NGOs receive so much criticism for this that I think it's really important that we do take a moment to try to applaud those donors and those NGOs that are making positive steps. And give them the visibility that they deserve. And there's a number of organisations. I know that Christian Aid have now changed their policy to make sure that they haven't set a percentage, but some indirect costs must be passed down to the local and national actors. I know that Oxfam have been in conversations about doing the same. The Dutch Relief Alliance have now introduced a rule that there must be a budget line showing the amount of indirect costs that have been passed down. These are great examples, and these people should be applauded for it. And by applauding them, we will encourage others to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And again, lots of questions in the chat, but I just want to ask a quick question. So I think that an uncomfortable truth is that, unfortunately, progress happens when there is a pressure for it to happen. and especially if there is a financial pressure. What role do you think that donors could play in changing the current practices that are not, best practices, that could directly, impact local organizations and could benefit from these?
I mean, donors have a huge amount of power and influence in the sector. And therefore, if we insisted on rules changing, the rest of the sector would align itself to those rules. And there have been some positive changes. I mean, the UN now is far more transparent on their funding channels and their distributions of funds. But at the moment, there's very little pressure for donors to change. And the current policies are very easy for us to implement. So we've got to be thinking more about how can we assert pressure on donors? And then, as I say, how do we give visibility to donors that have made positive changes so that there's an incentive for other donors to follow suit?
Thank you, Steve. Right, so our last panelist, and I know that we're running out of time, is Fran Gerling. She's from Development Initiatives, and I know that you have been working on a research commissioned by UNICEF and Oxfam. So really excited to hear from you some of your findings. So over to you, Fran.
Great, thanks so much, Miriam, and thanks to the START Network for inviting DI to be part of this really interesting conversation. It's been great to hear the panelists so far. So yeah, my name's Fran Gerling. I'm a Senior Policy and Engagement Advisor with DI. We're an international development research organisation. And as Miriam mentioned, it's great to be here today to be able to contribute to this discussion by sharing some of the findings from a recent study that we've been doing with Oxfam and with UNICEF as part of the Interagency Standing Committee Results Group 5 on this issue of the cascading of overheads to local and national partners, which has been identified as a kind of priority area for them. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly and just share a couple of slides to present findings from a couple of areas which I think are relevant to this conversation. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Let me skip on. So just very briefly as a bit of background to the study that we've been doing, the aim was to investigate the current state of overhead sharing with local and national partners by doing two things. By firstly mapping what current practices are of UN agencies and NGOs. And I think in total, we've looked at around 20 organisations. And secondly, conducting some interviews and focus group discussions with local and national NGOs to understand from their perspective what good practice looks like, and to touch on some of the examples that previous speakers have spoken on so far. I think in total, we spoke with around 28 organisations from 11 countries. And the idea is that this study is going to feed into a best practice guidance note, which will go for endorsement by the IASC. So the first thing I wanted to just mention was what we found in our study in terms of what good practice looks like for local and national NGOs. And I think this will kind of reinforce what many of the panelists and colleagues from Bangladesh have said so far. Firstly, I should say that it's clearly a very inconsistent picture. ICR sharing often does not happen, and practice varies a lot, both between INGOs and also within INGOs in different country contexts. But where ICR was shared, we found that three kind of key priorities emerged for local actors. Firstly, this point that it's the conditions and the characteristics of overhead funding are really important. Overhead funding needs to be provided as unrestricted funding, unaudited, and not time bound, so not having to be spent within a project duration. And this is both a matter of principle, because local NGOs should receive ICR in the same way that their INGO counterparts do, but it's also a matter of effectiveness, as we've heard, because if funding comes with certain conditions attached, it doesn't have the same value, and it can't be used in the same way to meet real organisational priorities. Secondly, the provision of overheads shouldn't squeeze or undermine direct project costs. And I think this is going to be a common experience both for INGOs and local actors. The best case examples are where organisations could use the overheads to really develop their organisational capacity rather than having to use it to plug programme budgets and gaps in other budgets. And what's critical here, I think, is having clear definitions of what we mean by direct cost and what we mean by indirect cost, which I'll come on to again later. Finally, all the examples of good practice were where there was clear transparency around budgets between international partners and national partners, and where there was consistency in policies, because there is so much inconsistency around the provision of overheads for local actors, which means they're not able to forecast properly. They come to negotiations every time with their partners, and don't know where they stand. So having clarity in the position on overheads is really important. The last thing I wanted to touch on was what we've identified that we think needs to change. And I think this really builds on some of the principles, Steve, that you just outlined. You know, indirect cost recovery generally is a really complex and often opaque issue, and it's been opaque for a number of years. And I think there needs to be 3 system-wide issues that need to be addressed to overcome that. Firstly, there needs to be a system-wide commitment in principle and in practice to providing overheads for local and national partners. Overheads are an intrinsic part of programme delivery for any organisation, and I think the justification has been clearly made, both from an ethical standpoint and from an effectiveness standpoint. But we have to acknowledge that at the same time, the sharing of ICR has real implications for INGOs, and we need to have open and honest dialogue about this. As such, we think it needs to be made a sector priority, and it would be a suitable topic for a grand bargain caucus, as well as for donor coordination groups like the Good Humanitarian Donorship, and of course INGO networks like Charter for Change. Secondly, any discussion around the equitable sharing of ICR is inevitably somewhat stalled by the fact that there isn't harmonised cost classifications. And I think agreeing common definitions, for example, those put forward by the IASC based on the Money Where It Counts protocol, are really essential for transparent and for fairer provision of ICR. And it's only once we have that shared understanding of cost classifications that we can have a more honest conversation around budgeting, and having a more honest conversation around what the true cost of delivering quality humanitarian programs is, and what the traditional set rates are really based on. I think for donors and intermediaries, clearly there's a need to start providing sufficient overheads for partners. The stakeholders that we interviewed as part of this research really want to see donors incentivising change more, by stipulating that ICR is shared with local and national NGOs, while also committing to meeting the cost incurred by all actors in the programme. I think donors could also incentivise change by requesting intermediaries share policies on ICR, by including a budget line, as Steve mentioned, by even requesting transparency and information on how intermediaries will cascade overheads. We found that led to change in some cases. Final point, I think, which is why this is a great event, is that all actors need to be publicising their engagement on this issue. It's clearly a live topic. Most of the INGOs we spoke with are currently in the process of developing a policy on this. And I think that the current groundswell behind this issue needs to be capitalised on now to ensure that change happens fast and we can start addressing some of these iniquities in our funding system. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for including us in this great panel discussion, and look forward to the rest of it.
Thank you, Fran. So again, a few questions in the chat, and I have some questions as well, but I wanted to ask the audience if they have any questions, either to Fran or to the other panelists. We only have a few minutes. So yeah, wanted to hear from you.
Not a question, but something to add.
Can I ask you to use the mic? Sorry, just for the majority of our audience is online. So
yeah, no, yeah, this is fascinating. My name's Tim Waits. I'm with the Australian mission here in Geneva, humanitarian advisor. Before that, I was with FCDO, and before that, I was with DFID. Localization is our one grand bargain commitment that we're following the Australians, and we are working mainly in the Asia Pacific. Just to say that I've been talking to people in Geneva, the donors in Geneva, and Denmark are the new co-conveners for localization. And they gave a little presentation, and two things they said was interesting, because yeah, what has been missing until Steve started talking was the donor perspective. And we can drive this, I think, much more forcefully than we are at the moment. But there are a lot of people, donors out there, who are looking at how to do this through the caucus. Now, what Denmark do is they're asking all their partner-funded INGOs to document how much they transfer to their local partners. That's kind of a condition of their funding. And I don't know how many donors are doing that. And they're also asking that the money... I'm not sure of the detail of it. I want to follow this up to find out. But the second part is they're asking that their partners give the same flexible funding to the local partners that they give to the INGOs. Now, I think that would fix a lot of things, just those two things. But I like your principles. Let's have a chat.
Thank you so much for your comment. Anyone else? Or I don't know if you wanted to reply or to that?
Just to recognise the great work that the Australians have done over the last 4 or 5 years in the Pacific. Really good, strong work on localisation.
Great. Anyone else? A question or comment? I don't know, any questions from you to other panelists? If not, I'll go to the chat. Or I don't know, Jahin, Mostak, Fran, any questions that you wanted to ask to each other? There's a conversation.
We speak together lots, so it'd be interesting to see if there's any questions online.
Okay, if there are no other questions from you. Yes, we have a few. So, okay. So what were the top 3 initial challenges from INGO members while advocating for ICR, expecting some examples and key approach adopted by Starfund Bangladesh to overcome those challenges? I don't know who wants to take that question.
Maybe Mostak.
Mostak, I don't know if you would like to take that question.
Yeah, thank you. I want to echo with Steve what he said earlier in his presentation. It's definitely ICR is such a funding mechanism which actually required by the INGOs to manage their expenditures at headquarter or member level. So this is also important. Without that, they cannot survive, which is very much, truly speaking, is very much important, and this is realistic. But as we discussed further, I think we can check with our headquarters, member agencies, the different models that has been shared by Steve. I think the last one is very much interesting for me. I mean, division of ICRs among international NGOs headquarters, country office level, then partner levels. So those are the areas I think we can advocate. But challenges, of course, will be there because this is the amount that actually supports INGOs headquarters as well as their member agencies to manage their expenses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mostak. Another question that we have is, do you believe that local NGOs have a role to play when it comes to ICR sharing? If so, what should they do both individually and collectively? Anyone wants to take that question?
I can take the question. Thank you. I think it's the first thing I will say is the united voice, and there needs to be greater unity among the local organizations in terms of, when it's about ICR sharing while they are negotiating. As we have heard from Jahin in his presentation, that even if I want to have a proper share of ICR, that may mean that I'm cornered, and then the other donors or INGOs are not accessing doing partnership with me. So that's one thing, is about that unity, united voice, and the collective influence. The other thing is very, very important, is evidencing the impact. There is a perception that local organization, they take the ICR in the executive director's pocket. So that's not always true, and that's not in most of the cases true. So, but there are wider perceptions. It prevails because of certain political economy we all know about. So how we do about, how we create more evidence that we are investing the ICR in a very smart way, and that's kind of contributing to the quality of the responses. And so evidencing the impact, I will say, is the second important thing. The third issue, I really wish that we need to have very free, frank, and open conversations with respect to others' opinion. That's what we seldom do. There are platforms, but I think the platforms are also polarized. We have platforms of INGOs, we have platforms of NGOs, but we need to have a common platform where all the different entities are coming and conversing frankly, freely about some of the challenges and how they complement each other. So they all need to find their fit. They all need to find their kind of old roles and responsibilities in the humanitarian ecosystem. We also need to believe that we are part of an ecosystem and we are not everything, and we are part of the ecosystem and we have a role to play and we can complement each other. So knowing about our own existence when we are working, are we from NGO, are we from INGO? If I am from INGO, then what I should be doing and what I should be, living for others, and how we create space for others. And it's relatively equivalent. I mean, it's very important also for the local organizations to understand how much they will be able to do and what kind of support they need to seek from the international NGOs. So I really believe in peaceful and negotiated coexistence, and that's possible only if there are free and frank conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajid. We have a question for Fran. Have co-financing burdens been factored into the analysis? And is there any advocacy work happening to challenge donors on these practices, given that cost recovery gains are so frequently lost through co-fi liabilities?
Yeah, thank you. This was something which came up in a couple of interviews with local NGOs, whereby they're sort of presented with the scenario where either ICR is shared, but you then have to also share the co-financing responsibilities, or ICR isn't shared. So in that first case, say they receive a 5% ICR, that might immediately then be cancelled out because it has to contribute towards the co-financing. So that definitely came up as a challenge. And I think, I mean, from the perspective of INGOs, their argument is, well, if we're sharing ICR, we don't have the same income, so we also need to share this responsibility for co-funding. And I think, I mean, it's a difficult one, and I'll be interested to know what other people think, but we clearly need to have more open conversations around this, and that we need to start from partnership principles, and there probably isn't a one-size-fits-all. And partners need to acknowledge the strengths and perhaps the risks that different partners can take on in these grant agreements. But I think, yeah, it's definitely a challenge for sure.
Thank you, Fran. We have another question from Humantum. Well, it's actually a proposition, I think. What if INGOs and local NGOs sign a tripartite agreement with the INGO's back donor for program project implementation? Any reactions on that? I don't know who wants to say this.
Could you say that again, please?
What if INGOs and local NGOs sign a tripartite agreement with the INGO's back donor for program project implementation? That's from Humantum.
I'm not sure how that would work. Again, you need. I do think there is something about trying to get joint agreements on this. And if I may, I mean, a question to Sajid is, what's the chance of him getting together with his other network executives, and if all the major local and national actors together with some of the large INGOs in Bangladesh got together and said, we will not accept any funds unless there is X amount of ICR for downstream partners. I mean, do you think that is a real possibility? Is that something you could take to donors?
I always say that START network, the unique selling point, the USP is that it's a network of local, national, international organizations, which means that it provides that opportunity for that discussions. And as we have the NGOs and INGOs in platforms, 47 member organizations coming together, having that conversation, that's possible. And I think what is already happening in Bangladesh, it is because of that, open face-to-face conversations. And also kind of, I think a partnership brokering is also required from the secretariat side, from Start Fund Bangladesh, from the like-minded agencies. And also we need internal advocates, within INGOs, within NGOs, and within donors. So yes, it's very much possible.
Great. Well, we only have 5 more minutes. So Fakrul, I would like to give the floor to you now.
So thank you all the panel members for your valuable thoughts, comments, and brief presentations. And we Start Fund Bangladesh, as well as our member agencies, we have been working together to do some systematic changes already you have seen. And I would like to sum up our discussion within two points. First point, we have seen the first issues sharing ICR is the key to advance to the localization agenda and beneficial to the wider humanitarian sector. But how? And if you see local organizations, they are using ICR amount in a different ways, and different organizations utilize the overhead cost in the different ways. And if you see, it means donor compliance and resource mobilization. Some of local and national NGOs utilize the ICR amount for immediate response during COVID, even the flood, and it is really ensured our accountability to the community. And we also heard NGOs as well as donor agencies. It is beneficial for both partner agencies and awarded agencies in some way. And I think sharing ICR to local organizations helps them to use those resources freely, and they have their own decision-making power, and agencies to determine how better to use those funds. And this enables them to feel empowered, and it helps to strengthen local civil society in the long term. And another issues I would like to mention, what would be our responsibilities as a humanitarian actor? And we found there should have a common understanding on ICR overhead cost. The definition of ICR overhead have different meaning to different organizations. Some agencies would like to approach it as a management cost. Some organization it call is NPCA. But if there is no agreement in using the same concept, all entities should, I think, have a common understanding when it comes to providing ICR. And we must make sure every project has an option of ICR. And second thing, ICR should be unrestricted. We have seen some NGOs also shared ICR due to our advocacies as well as their commitment to localization, but we have seen it is still some cases is restricted, but it should be unrestricted as per definition. And lastly, we have seen in the some cases we should have a actually standard protocol, and most of the agencies believe that sharing ICR should be fair and equitable. A standard protocol for sharing equal ICR across all projects is required. ICR can be shared between NGOs, headquarters, and country offices, as well as between partners. And that's why the humanitarian sector needs the common understanding and should promote good practices around the ICR sharing. And I think without our support, without our commitment, including NGOs, donor agencies, it is not possible to reach our goal as well as to promote the practices sector-wide. So I think let's move our conversation to commitment. I think we need a concrete commitment towards the localizations and as well as a principle of partnership. So thank you. Over to Mariam.
Thank you, Fakrul, and thank you to all our panelists and the people that joined here in person and everyone that has joined remotely. This is a conversation that is difficult to have. I think that we have been advocating for this, but we understand that there are a lot of internal challenges still at STAR Network. So thank you for being in this journey with us, and have a nice day.